human beings. Today we are going to be covering the INTP personality in depth. I already did the free, oddly specific INTP things. I usually release those as an interlude to all the full breakdown of personality types that I do, so you can check that out in the description box down below if you're interested. And the way that I do these videos is I start by breaking down the INTP's cognitive functions, so the cognitive functions in the INTP's primary ego stack. We'll talk about some of the vibe, some of the feeling of the INTP, what kind of characteristics you can sort of notice a lot of the time in INTPs, although they differ from person to person, obviously, just like any other personality type. We'll go over some of the potential strengths, sort of like where the INTP tends to excel and do really well. We'll talk about some of the weaknesses and sort of like some of the more common pain points and difficulty points for the INTP. And then at the end, I give a big list of examples. I mean, I've only got a few examples for you here, but you'll kind of notice the INTP essence in some of those examples, hopefully. So let's get into it. With the INTP cognitive functions, for you as an INTP, the first cognitive function that is being used, so the primary cognitive function in your ego stack, is introverted thinking. Introverted thinking is concerned with principle and logic. It is very much concerned with having a quite pure understanding of the thing itself. It's not knowledge in the pragmatic sense, such as extroverted thinking. It's not necessarily about applying the understanding. It's more about having a very fleshed out, detailed view of how something works. And it's introverted thinking is particularly good at noticing underlying patterns and principles. I imagine introverted thinking often like a scalpel. It's very sharp and it's very precise. It has the ability to wade through a lot of distinctions in knowledge. And when introverted thinking is being used at a more advanced level, in the case of the INTP, it is the hero, so it's a dominant function here. It's what's going to be clocked in the most. It's like I usually call it like the fish in water function. It's what just the primary expression of your mind usually is. It's at its highest level, it's to do with understanding. So it's usually about actually getting a definition. What is this thing? How does this thing actually work? And then at a deeper level, actually really having a embodied sense of understanding. So it's a deep kind of understanding. The INTP, very concerned with having a very precise understanding, and this is held to be a high value for you as an INTP. So the secondary function, or the parental function for you as an INTP, is extroverted intuition. Extroverted intuition is concerned with envisioning, it's concerned with exploring broad possibilities, and it's very much concerned with exploring broad bodies of knowledge. So introverted thinking is kind of, like I said, going in with a scalpel, and it's sort of understanding these principles at a deep level, but it's looking to understand principles at a very broad level. So for an INTP, there's often a sense of quite strong open-mindedness. There's a sense of exploring different possibilities, learning how different systems work, and creating distinctions in those systems. At a higher level, extroverted intuition, as it's in the parental function there, at a higher level, it's to do with enabling. So it comes into, we're envisioning the possibility, and then we're looking to actually flesh that out and understand it with introverted thinking. And then how do we enable that possibility to exist? You'll notice that a lot of INTPs, famous INTPs, you might know, they tend to be very much involved in creating better systems. They're envisioning what's possible within the framework of their society, within the framework of their business, or even social structures in some cases, and having that very broad understanding there. It's a divergent form of intuition, where you have introverted intuition is much more convergent. It's much more focused on the path ahead, the way. It's piercing through. It's very much about depth. Extroverted intuition is very much about breadth, but obviously they overlap in their own way. So with a really broad understanding of different principles and different bodies of knowledge, there is going to be a lot of depth in that as well, obviously. The tertiary function for you as an INTP, so on an axis to extroverted intuition there, you have introverted sensing. Introverted sensing is to do with the implementation. The tertiary function for you as an INTP is introverted sensing, same as me for an INFP. Introverted sensing is to do with implementing. It's very much to do with homeostasis. Introverted sensing in the child slot for you as an INTP and me as an INFP, we like comfortable environments. We like to implement an environment where it is working for us. We're not the kind of people to fly by the seat of our pants and just be darting from one thing to the other. Although you as an INTP might be doing that with your theories and knowledge, in the actual environment, there is more of a sense of wanting to have something more consistent and more comfortable. There's a sense of wanting to implement. These theories and understandings into the surroundings as well with the INTP. At a higher level, it's to do with verification and accounting for. So you'll notice with the INTP, like I said with that scalpel, there's a kind of a granular splitting through of understandings, and there's a verifying, there's an accounting for these levels of understanding. And introverted sensing, very much, like I said, it likes to have the environment accounted for. And this tends to be an area of kind of like a bit of a dependent area. The tertiary function tends to be an area where we can kind of cling to, especially earlier in life. And we'll talk a little bit about the potential SI-TI loop there for the INTP later in the potential weaknesses section. The inferior and the final function for the INTP in the INTP ego is extroverted feeling. Extroverted feeling is very much concerned with ethics. It's the group feeling. It's how everyone feels in the surrounding area. This can be a bit of a struggle area for you as an INTP, actually relating and making connections to other people. This doesn't have to be a difficulty, and I know that some INTPs are fantastic at connecting with other people, and it's definitely something to be grown into. The inferior function is often considered the aspirational function. So it's the function that you're looking to sort of bring more into your life, and you can see a lot of INTPs have this interesting quality where they're going to want to understand how to approach situations with connecting people before they just do it organically. With a more FE, strong type, there's a sense of just kind of naturally being able to flow with the feelings of the group, where as an INTP, that can be a bit more clunky for you naturally. So there's a sense of wanting to understand, maybe that's why you're watching this video, there's a sense of wanting to understand your own personality structure and other people so you can actually move with the energy of the group better. At a higher level, extroverted feeling is concerned with affirming and relating to. It's being able to relate to other people. It's being able to connect to the energy of the group a lot. It doesn't necessarily just mean to connect with people. Extroverted feeling is also sort of just the felt sense of energy in an environment. So there's a sense of being able to tune into what's going on around you in a very tangible, embodied, felt way. So that's the inferior function for an INTP, and you can notice there's sometimes a bit of a struggle there, and we'll talk a bit more about this as we go on, but a keynote to acknowledge with INTPs is there is a strong emphasis on honesty and truth. I actually think for the INTP, the highest values do really come into truth and sovereignty. There's a sense of, I want to understand how this works for myself, and I also want to have a really honest, direct understanding of what's going on. So in social interactions, you can imagine that being quite difficult in a way, because if you have a lot of extroverted feeling strong types, which is a lot more of the population, there tends to be a sense of just blending with what's going on in the environment, what everyone's feeling right now, and how we can kind of connect to it. The INTP is not just going to you're not just going to buy in to whatever's going on. You're going to want to understand that it's true, that it's authentic, and that you can verify it, that you can settle into it. So like I said, this can be a bit of a struggle area for the INTP. But anyway, that's the 4 cognitive functions making up the INTP ego there. Okay, what is the vibe of an INTP like? Like I'm saying, this will differ from person to person. There's no real stereotype that we can give that accurately depicts any personality type holistically across the board. But generally, some things that I tend to notice for the INTP vibe, there's a bit of a talking head energy in a sense. There's very much a thought first approach. There's a strong sense of wanting to decipher and understand. And like I said, there's a strong emphasis on truth. So you have someone who is quite specific in a lot of ways. You have someone who is very much engaged with ideas. They usually want to speak to you about their ideas and their understandings, and that extroverted intuition there as well. They like to speculate a lot. They like to speculate on different topics, and there's a sense of wanting to delve into them and really understand the principle there. When we're understanding different bits of information constantly, like you as an INTP, you're probably involved in a lot of different kinds of your own hobbies. You probably have a strong hobby for learning. So when you're doing that over time, obviously our brain wants to make that more efficient. So that's really where introverted thinking comes in, and it creates these underlying themes. So an INTP, very good at noticing underlying principles, someone who tends to come off as very adept at being able to understand something in depth because they do it for its own sake. It's not necessarily to reach some kind of, it's not a means to an end thing. It's a sense of wanting to actually understand in depth. So you have someone who tends to be quite cerebral and quite heady. As I said about the values, truth and sovereignty, there tends to be, I notice with INTPs, a strong emphasis on really being honest. There's a sense of, what is actually meant by what I'm saying here? My words have weight. When someone says something to me, I'm not just going to take it in and be like, oh yeah, I'm just following the vibe of what they're saying. It's like, no, I want to actually understand what that means. So there's a strong sense of wanting to really be honest and really wanting to authenticate and match those words up to the most resonant understanding. So this can come off as a little bit intense in a way. I actually have a friend who's an INTP, and the way that she when I'll speak to her, I notice that she can kind of retain different points in the conversation, and she can fairly effortlessly bounce back and forth between these points, and she's just delving into them, and then she's presenting them, fleshing them out, and then moving on to the next thing. And there's something very structural and logical about it, where for me as an INFP, I tend to flow through information more. I wouldn't really remember those points. I'll remember kind of the general values and themes, and then I'll kind of move into my own idealistic version of that, where there tends to be more of an intellectual edge, I notice, for INTPs. You can have someone who tends to, they don't really tend to like very intense activity, loud, strong, heavy kind of environments. I can't really imagine INTPs most of the time really wanting to go to a music festival or something like that, or loving the roaring vibe of a crowd, jumping up and enjoying that group energy and being a part of something. I think this is often going to be a bit of an area of intimidation for an INTP, but we'll talk more about that soon. But yeah, I noticed there tends to be a sense of wanting to be quite contained physically, but also wanting to be very unlimited intellectually. There can also be a sense of having, I've said in my oddly specific video, there's a sense of having a very particular sense of humor. And noticing these underlying themes, like we're talking about, the sense of humor, it can be a bit dry in a way, but very poignant. Like they'll make points, and when you actually consider it, it's like, whoa, like, and it can really crack me up personally, because they'll notice how absurd something is, or they'll notice how they've kind of thought about how all these different parts are playing together, and then it's just like, here's a little quip or a joke about that, and it can be really precise. And I think the essence of good humor is how precise it can be and how much it can make you recognize the truth of a situation. And I said in my oddly specific video, a good example of this is Louis C.K. He strikes me as a very strong INTP sense of humor. Let's get into the potential strengths and weaknesses that I tend to notice for the INTP. Some of the potential strengths I notice for the INTP, like I said, the ability to actually delve in and understand something at a very deep level, a very fleshed out level. For me as an INFP, if I want to understand something, I'm primarily sort of looking for how it relates to me and how I can implement it into my core philosophy. But with that extroverted thinking inferior that I have, I sometimes tend to skip over very major details, and it's only really later on that I'll recognize that I've not really understood something particularly well, or I've gleaned some insight from a book or something. Even if I'm reading a fiction book, I've picked up on something, but I haven't really understood exactly what that principle, what the principle really is there, or what that really means underneath. Where for an INTP, there's a sense of they will go in and they will understand it very completely. And this can be really amazing to watch. This level of depth and understanding and how it can apply to systems when it's implemented properly is phenomenal. So there can be this is the kind of understanding I want to really paint this for you. This is the kind of understanding that can completely change a dynamic because it is that in depth. And a lot of the time we are just kind of bouncing around and operating on preformed understanding, where as an INTP, you're going to actually take that time to understand it for yourself. Like I said, there's a strong value for sovereignty there. So there's a sense of wanting to actually have your own fleshed out understanding of a situation. So depth of understanding is a massive strength I see for INTPs. The second strength I notice, a little bit related there, is the ability to think in terms of systems with that extroverted intuition. There is an exploration of whole bodies of information. They're taking in massive amounts of data at once, and when you're understanding at a deep level all the time, you're noticing that these pieces of information that you're picking up on, they don't work in isolation. They're not in a vacuum. They are all sort of different sides of a whole. And I think INTPs can be very good at noticing how different parts of information relate to others. So it's like, yes, that does make sense, but it makes sense assuming that there's this platform underneath it, and that relates to this philosophical idea, and that philosophical idea paves the way for this understanding. And then and you'll notice INTPs, they tend to have sort of like an ability to database information because it's very important to have scaffolded information. There's an acknowledgement of different elements of knowledge and how they fit into one another. So this is really in-depth understanding, holistic thinking a lot of the time, and yes, systems thinking. So a strength for systems and holistic thinking, I notice, for the INTP. It sounds like a funny one, but like I said before, sense of humor. The sense of humor for the INTP, this is actually more important than I could probably give credence to, because like saying you have that extroverted feeling inferior, so there has to be a way of naturally connecting to people when that can be an insecurity point. Typically, our inferior point is a point of insecurity. So humor can be a very natural connecting agent for an INTP. There can be a sense of knowing how to hit at certain strings in a way where it does really win people over. I think the sense of humor for you as an INTP is very endearing. And I think if you feel confident enough to let that out and sort of embody your natural sense of humor, I think that is a fantastic strength and one of the most beautiful elements of the INTP personality that I notice. Oftentimes, introverted feeling is considered to be the more morally focused function, but I would actually say that for an INTP, as they develop more, there is a strong sense of moral. In these principles that we're understanding, and this kind of logic that's being understood here, there is a strong sense of having these principles become moral because it's like understanding the concepts like free will, free agency, sovereignty. Again, what is a good way to live? I think at a higher level, an INTP is being able to, like I said, understand things at different angles and integrate them into a way of living that is very authentic and very natural. Although the INTP, you can be a bit clunky as you're figuring that out, and I think it can be difficult to just be thrown into institutions and social circumstances for me as well as an INFP. But when there is a more refined understanding and the information is applied first, I feel like the sense of being able to be really deeply moral and actually offer other people choices and be able to explain things and paint pictures for other people of what's possible is a massive strength there as well for you as an INTP. What are some of the potential weaknesses or difficulty points that I notice? I can notice that there can be a issue assimilating to social environments and situations because the structure of socializing a lot of the time, it's not really based on what is most authentic and what is most true. And if you're naturally picking up on a lot of these incongruences and you're noticing that, hey, you guys are just sort of pretending to like one another, this is kind of fake, or you're noticing, hey, you're sort of trying to manipulate me here. I can see very clearly how you're not really treating me the best here. I'm not really able to step into my free will here, and obviously having a lot of jobs and being in a lot of social situations can feel like that. I think there can be a difficulty assimilating naturally and sort of moving and flowing through because I think, and I think that's when there can be getting caught in that FE grip a little bit and sort of feeling like, oh, I don't really even feel like I can connect to other people. So I think because of that strong value for authenticity and that strong value of wanting to explore ideas, a lot of people aren't going to want to do that naturally. And I think this can be a particular difficulty point if you're an INTP female watching this, because I think there are social expectations put on men and women that obviously differ. And if you show up, a lot of women show up with extroverted feeling as a higher function. So if you show up and you don't necessarily want to just naturally validate everyone, you don't necessarily want to just flow into what everyone else is feeling and just kind of vibe, you actually would prefer to have like an engaging discussion and understand things. I think some of the social elements can be really difficult for you there. So that's something I notice as a difficulty. There's a sense of not really liking loud and kind of noisy, heavy environments. And I think this can even be something like, if you want to actually consider and think, the world can feel a bit violating sometimes. It can feel a bit intense that there's sort of always stuff going on. Maybe particularly for a younger INTP, there's a sense that I don't really want to necessarily be in a crowd right now. I don't necessarily want to just go out and do all these things that I'm not really in congruence with. But sometimes you're just getting swept up in those things, or you might get dragged along to something, and there can be a sense of not really enjoying it that much. I don't think that you as an INTP are naturally going to click into very sort of loud and boisterous environments and people as well. There can be a sense of feeling a little bit uneasy around people who are quite brash and boisterous, I think, and like I said, especially for a younger INTP. There's an interesting picture. I'm going to try to find it and put it right next to me here. There's this picture that I've noticed of like a guy who's like standing on some books, and then he's kind of seeing a brick wall. Or sorry, he's standing on this. There's this picture that I've seen where there's a guy sort of standing and he can see a little bit on these few books, and then he kind of goes up more, and then there's just kind of like a darkness or a brick wall. And then as he kind of goes up, there's a sense of that level of understanding. He can see the whole vista in front of him. And I think that this is a great depiction of what the essence of the weak point is for the INTP to me. There's a sense of, as you're kind of learning to integrate these systems and this level of understanding, in the meantime, there can be quite a bit of difficulty, because through the middle there, as you're building up your life the way you want to, as you're learning to understand things that other people seem to just be able to do naturally, there's a sense of maybe feeling a bit like, I don't really get why we're doing this. And I think there can be sometimes sort of like I said about the TI-SI loop, there can be a sense of like, I don't really understand why I'm doing this. I kind of just want to retreat. I kind of want to block with my knowledge. Knowledge is obviously a great tool for you to open up as an INTP and to understand things better, but I also think it can be used as a bit of a shield sometimes. And if you're in that loop of TI-SI, it's like, I feel comfortable in my understanding here. I don't really feel like people are really getting what I'm saying. People might even seem kind of dumb to me a lot of the time, and I'm just going to kind of hide behind that because I don't really know right now how to tune into my NE and see how there's maybe a new possibility. Maybe I could integrate better, and that's connecting to that FE. And it's like, oh, I could connect better and I could connect with other people. I think that's more like the growth point for you as an INTP. But in SITI there, it's like, I'm comfortable with my understanding right now. Other people don't understand me. And I feel a bit like you can feel a bit stuck in that. So I noticed that as a weak point. Another weak point that I notice, and the last one I'll mention here, is there can be a sense of post-processing of emotions. I mentioned this in the oddly specific. A sense of like, something might happen and you might not really process the feelings of it until later. And this doesn't have to be a weakness. This can actually just be a natural part of your processing. But I think it can be a weakness in the sense that if you have a lot of emotions that you haven't really processed and you're just kind of moving through life and you're understanding the next thing and you're moving on to that and then you're implementing this thing over here, but you might not really have come in touch with how you feel until later on. And I've actually heard a lot of INTPs in interviews I've watched leading up to making this, where I'll notice as a female, they'll say as they develop, they'll actually take time to process their emotions. They'll have a time for themselves where they do actually just sort of process what's going on for them. a bit more. They might light a candle and take a bath, or they might have a chat with someone who can sort of get them out of themselves a bit more. And then it's like recognizing, yeah, I didn't really feel very good about that, or I actually should feel really positive about this thing that's happened. So sometimes there can be a bit of a lag time with emotions, I noticed there, and kind of maybe a little bit of distance from feeling there. I mean, it can be a sense of, it is in the lowest of the functions for you as an INTP. So they say FI demon. There's a sense of like, it can come out when you feel attacked, or when you feel like the energy is too intense. There's a sense of these feelings can kind of just erupt up, and you don't really know what to do with them at the time. So there has to be a gradual kind of immersion in emotion and feeling. And sometimes, like I said, there's a bit of a lag time there. So it might not just be a natural flowing into emotion. So that can be a potential weak point in situations if emotions get a bit blocked there, and maybe you're not really comfortable going into them at that time. Okay, let's get into an examples list. And I say that in every one of these videos, that these examples, I'm not giving you examples of people who I think are actually INTPs, or systems that are primarily run by INTPs. They're just examples that I notice sort of carry the essence of INTP thought there, of sort of like the INTP pattern. So I'll just give a couple of these, and hopefully you can kind of pick up on that trend or that pattern that's kind of behind my words there. And the first thing I'm going to actually do is I'm going to read you a excerpt from an article about Kantian ethics. So Immanuel Kant was a philosopher, and he is almost definitely an INTP in my mind. I'm going to read you this article from something that he's saying about utilitarianism, and I want you to sort of listen for how there's a bit of a trend here that you'll notice. This seems very much like an INTP pattern playing out. So I'll read you that now. So the problem with utilitarianism. In Kant's view, the basic problem with utilitarianism is that it judges actions by their consequences. If your action makes people happy, it's good. If it does the reverse, it's bad. But is this actually contrary to what we might call moral common sense? Consider this question. Who is the better person, the millionaire who gives $1,000 to charity in order to score points with his Twitter following, or the minimum wage worker who donates a day's pay to charity because she thinks it's her duty to help the needy? If consequences are all that matter, then the millionaire's actions is technically the better one. But that's not how the majority of people would see the situation. Most of us judge actions more for their motivation than their consequences. The reason is obvious. The consequences of our actions are out of control, just as the ball is out of the pitcher's control once it's left his hand. I could save a life at the risk of my own, and the person I could save could turn out to be a serial killer. Or I could accidentally kill someone in the course of robbing them, and in doing so might unwittingly save the world from a terrible tyrant. So what's really being said there, I'm noticing that there's that strong sense of, it's not just about an outcome or a result. It's not an extroverted thinking, pragmatic approach. It's really about what is the underlying principle there. What is underneath? And this is an example of very strong introverted thinking. It's exploring what it is and actually understanding how this thing actually, like, this is an example of what I was saying about how introverted thinking can become very moral when its principles are more refined and more developed. There is a sense there of, we're going in to actually understand at a very granular level what is actually meant by this philosophy, what is actually meant by what is being said here. And we're going to understand it at a deep level. So that's just an excerpt I'm going to give you from Kantian ethics there, and hopefully you can see there's a sort of like that INTP trend there. Again, this is not an example from an INTP. This is just something that very much reminds me of INTP thinking. The philosophy of Nassim Taleb, the idea that we can't really possibly know what is going to happen next. It's a principled sense of how there can be, how to embrace uncertainty. It's embracing through a sense of understanding. There's a logical notion and understanding of how we can't actually understand all that comes next. It's not the same as like the way that I would sort of go about that more organically is like, I'm going to want to just sort of sense what is the right thing for me here? What is the value? And how do I kind of go into the unknown with the right vibration? How do I go into it and sort of align myself to it? How do I stay in alignment? Where for the INTP idea here, and what I'm seeing a little bit more in the work of Taleb, is like, we need to logically understand the principle of uncertainty And then once we understand it, we can immerse ourselves in it. Strikes me as a very INTP kind of trail of thinking. The last example I'll give here is agape love. Agape is the form of love that was taught by Jesus. I know it seems a bit of a surprise here in an INTP video. The principle behind agape love is love for its own sake. It's not love being contingent upon a certain set of circumstances. It's not romantic love because I like you. It's not love in the sense of, I think you're great because you fulfill this need for me. It's looking past all that, making sense of it, and it's looking to actually have an embodied sense of like real morality. You see, it's actually coming from, I would say, the heart, but in this case, I think it is coming from a certain framework of understanding where it's love at a deeper level. And I think that as an INTP advances, there is a sense of having a kind of connection to love at a deeper level where there might be a love of systems, and noticing how there's kind of there's certain interrelations in systems that can be quite beautiful, how information fits together. And I think this can happen for relationships as well for an INTP. There can be a sense of understanding that when we actually care about one another's growth, when we actually care about what's going on underneath with one another, when we can work with one another, and the principle there is that we do actually care about one another at a deep level. It's not contingent upon what you do or I do. And there's a sense of really giving in to the deeper principle. And I think agape sort of captures that. It's really unconditional love. I think this is kind of an advanced way of looking at sort of an INTP pattern. When I make these videos, I don't just want to talk about like sort of like some things you'll see in a stereotypical INTP. I want to try to do something where I'm driving more to the heart of what I can see this pattern growing into. So I know the notion of something like love might seem a bit foreign there, talking in a video about a type that is often I think every type is often misunderstood, to be honest. But looking into it, there's more of a sense of how can we actually develop these true underlying principles that guide us through life and allow us to implement better systems within our social structure, within the microcosm of our work and our personal relationships, and within the macrocosm of life as a whole. So I think agape love is a good sort of far off example there, and maybe that is tinged a bit by my INFP idealism. Okay, that is the full breakdown for the INTP. If you enjoyed this, you got value out of it, I appreciate you subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and sharing this to anyone you feel like would get value out of it, anyone in your life who you know is an INTP or you suspect might be an INTP. I have some exciting ideas for some new videos over the next couple weeks, so stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching. That's me. I hope you're having a beautiful day.